When my daughter was about 7 years old, I took her to a new pediatrician. When the doctor left the room, she turned to me and said, "Mommy, can boys be doctors?" I, of course, laughed, but up until that point, she had never seen a boy doctor. I say this because my guest today is Father Cathie Caimano, and Cathie and I both grew up Roman Catholic, and when we both started thinking about becoming priests, it seemed like it was not possible for us because in the Roman Catholic Church, guys are priests and girls are not, period. Well, Father Cathie Caimano claims that title in some ways for that reason, but there are other reasons too that I hope you enjoy listening to. We also discuss some of our favorite faith communities, including St. Phillips in Durham, North Carolina, Church of the Holy Trinity in Manhattan on the Upper East Side. We reminisce about being single clergy people at one time and things like online dating. We laugh a lot and we get pretty energetic, especially towards the end of our conversation, where we do spend time talking about some of the dreams we have for church now and in the future. I want to thank Cathie for being on this podcast with me and for the work she is bringing into the world. No matter your profession and no matter whether or not you're part of a church, I think you will really enjoy listening to her story of calling and career and the ways in which she sought out living into her intuitive sense of what she wanted to offer the world. And I think she offers deep wisdom in that way for all of us. Thanks so much for listening. If you are enjoying this podcast, please subscribe to it wherever you listen to it, and please consider sharing it with friends. I'm so grateful if you do that, but mostly I'm really grateful you're listening to this. Thanks, and now for my conversation with Father Cathie. Hi there, Father Cathie.
Hi there, Jan.
Thank you for making time and being with me and welcoming space to have an intentional conversation about many, many things, I'm sure. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here and honored to be invited.
I'm probably going to talk about it when I write and read the introduction to this episode. And I shared this with you when we reconnected, both with bringing church to people, your website and work and stuff we're going to talk about, and also just wanting to reconnect and me wanting to talk with you. But I can't tell you what it's like when you develop a collegial friendship relationship with someone who basically rocked your inner archetype of what a priest is. And I'll probably say more about this, like I said, but as you know, you were the first woman I ever saw as a priest with a collar in a pulpit. I mean, I have such a visual of that day at Church of the Holy Trinity. And so just to get us started, and because I don't even know if I know your story as to how you got to be called into ministry and what that calling was for you. So in whatever way you want to share some of that, I'd be grateful.
Thank you. You made me cry already. I haven't even said anything. So I'm sorry if I get weepy. Let's see. So I grew up like you, Roman Catholic, and I always, it never was like, I know a lot of people talk about struggling with the Roman Catholic Church, but that was just never my experience. I had a great aunt who was a Dominican nun. She was the first woman to get a PhD from St. John's University in New York.
Wow.
And she died when I was very young, but she just loomed in my life. Right. And so I always had this relationship with God. When I was a small child, I would go outside and I would talk to God. God would talk back to me, full sentences, right? Like I never talked about it because it never seemed like anything unusual because it's always been part of my life. Mm-hmm. So I went to Georgetown University, mostly because I was studying languages. I was a linguistics major and they had a language and linguistics school there. And it was also a Roman Catholic university. And it didn't really occur to me, like that just was part of it, but I really just fell in love with the faith life there that the Jesuits had. And so I worked at the campus ministry office. I sang in the chapel choir, and I took part in the retreat programs there, and I would go on silent retreats and go on retreats often during my years at school. And then at the very end, my senior year, I was on a silent retreat doing the Ignatian exercises, and everyone had left. We had had a Eucharist and everyone had left, and I stayed there in the chapel, and I just heard Jesus talking to me, and he said, "Do this in remembrance of me." And I knew in that he meant I was called to be a priest. And I had this I just had one of those experiences, and that it lasted, for probably 0.8 of a second, but it felt like forever, that I knew everything. That was the weird thing. I suddenly knew everything, and it was all good. It's just all good.
Mm-hmm.
And I just had that moment of oh, which I think, I later think that must be what heaven's like. That must be what it's like when you die.
I have to pause you for 1 second, because that phrase, to know everything, I believe when you say it, my understanding is you don't mean in an intellectual, knowledge-based capacity. You mean in the pure Julian of Norwich sense, all will be well, and all will be well, and all manner of things will be well. Yeah. And I just want you to make that point, yes, because we say that word know and we immediately associate it with knowledge. And that's not what you're talking about, I don't think.
No, not at all. I still don't know my multiplication tables. I've forgotten them. No, you're right. In that Julian of Norwich sense. And though that also that every intellectual thing that we tie ourselves up in also has a good answer. But no, I can write that down and tell you what it was. Thank you for that clarification. Absolutely. And so, I went back to my life as a college student and graduated from college. And I was like, that's funny. God is calling me to something that I can't do. Right. I just never, so I immediately thought, oh, well, I guess I'm going to be a Roman Catholic priest, but no, I was not going to be a Roman Catholic.
Oh, that's funny. They thought that at Vatican II too. Okay,
yeah,
go ahead.
Exactly. And bless my Jesuit friends, because they never discouraged me. And so, but I was a little angry to find out they were also sort of lying to me. So I went on my way, and I actually started working in psychological research. I thought I was going to become a psychologist. I did plane crash research for the government. There's a little tidbit. Yes. I also don't fly, just to
interesting. Because of that work?
No, actually not. Yes and no. It was a little, It was trauma research. Anyway, that's down a rabbit hole. But then I ended up moving sight unseen to Durham, North Carolina, because my office mate was leaving and he was getting his PhD in Durham at Duke. And he invited me to move down there. He was a friend. And he said, I'll find you a roommate. I'll find you a job. Come live in Durham, North Carolina. I had never been south of the Mason-Dixon line. Other than DC. And I was like, okay. And I just drove my little Chevette down to Durham, North Carolina, started working, doing Alzheimer's disease research. I thought I was going to go back to college and get my PhD in psychology. And then I accidentally discovered St. Phillips, the Episcopal Church, that we both know, just kind of accidentally was just kind of couldn't really find a Roman Catholic church that felt like the Jesuits, and I just walked into this place and I just fell in love. I thought, who was keeping this church from me? How did I not know about this church that feels like it felt like what the Jesuits had created at Georgetown, and like a place where I felt welcomed. It was spiritually rich. It was liturgically beautiful, but it was open to, exploring things. And it was just so beautiful. And I just immediately became an Episcopalian. And then, then every door just opened up. Then it was like, oh, we want to ordain you. And I was like, maybe this is what God meant. And so off I went. And so that was really fast. And then off I went. So that was
wow. So it's like your call you got swept up.
Yeah.
You got like a little swept up after an original inkling. There's a couple things I just want to circle back to. Yeah. I did not know the Georgetown connection, or I might have forgotten it, because one of the aspects in my journey to get to this place was a program I did at the Georgetown Institute for Transformational Leadership on learning about leadership coaching. And it was literally the Jesuit ethos that informs that place as well. I must say, as some encouragement from my husband who got his undergrad from Georgetown.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's awesome.
Yeah. And just generally the reviews of that program and the people I was connected with in that program, that really informs my desire to have these sorts of intentional conversations. And that Jesuit Jesuits are like the Episcopalians of Roman Catholicism.
Exactly. That's what I said. I said the Jesuits turned me into an Episcopalian, and I mean that as a compliment.
I hope they take it as a compliment,
I
because
hope so too.
it's that marriage of head and heart, and wanting to scrutinize aspects of faith.
Yep.
That's really empowering. And then the part of the story that I just also want to share so people understand that I was also in a period of sort of wondering and desiring faith community when somebody recommended their mom's church, which is Church of the Holy Trinity on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, 88th between 1st and 2nd, if you're there. And I walked in, I saw you, I sort of readily got involved. And then what wound up happening is I began an ordination process in the Diocese of New York that led me to basically take your job at St. Phillips in Durham, North Carolina.
I know. The Lord was in mysterious ways.
I know.
I went to New York to go to General Seminary, and then out of seminary, I went to Church of the Holy Trinity, and I met you there. Then I went back and was the associate at the church that sent me, which was St. Phillips. And then when I left, you came.
And that has always, amazed me. And I've been so grateful. I had no idea about Durham. I'm a New Yorker that thought Raleigh, Durham was one place because I'd already always seen it written that way. Yeah. And I really took some mentors and some people in my life really encouraged me to go, because I was terrified of living in a place like that. I've never been, like you, never had been there. Yeah. And still think there's something very unique about Durham, North Carolina, as being a very welcoming, transient in many ways.
Yeah, it's a adopted hometown. I lived there on and off for 20 years. I now live near Charlotte because I fell in love, and what happens? You fall in love, you move to the suburbs of Charlotte or some.
Yes, yes, I've moved in the same reason. Yeah,
but Durham is just the most magical place. It's my adopted hometown, and I always say, because I love New York too. New York has millions of fascinating people, but you hardly get to meet any of them.
Yep.
Durham has thousands of fascinating people, and you get to meet almost all of them.
Oh, wow. That's a beautiful way of, that is how it feels. And so I want to talk a little bit about that quality you were describing in St. Phillips, because after I released like the first kind of formal episode of this, a good friend of mine from college, who's not a religious-y person, kind of like you and me, she wrote me in a really wonderful, supportive, loving way saying, great conversation. By the way, are you trying to get people to go back to church? Because now I really want to go back to church. And in some ways, no. And in some ways, sure, because I am continuously both running towards and running away from this quality that you consistently find in faith communities that is incredibly healing and powerful and has to do with belonging and acceptance and growth and welcoming. And I discovered that at Church of the Holy Trinity, which was one of the reasons I went running towards the priesthood, thinking that, oh, wow, this is what the job will be like. Ha, ha, ha. And we're going to get to that too.
Right.
But I'd love to hear more about your experience with that feeling and how that's a part of not just then, but also now for you.
Yeah, that's a big question. Where do I bite that one off? Well, it's interesting that you made a connection between Holy Trinity and St. Phillips. And of course you did. And we've both found ourselves there, in both places, and found whatever that sort of quality is about them both. Part of me feels like both of them are, well, because they are urban churches, right? So there is something about, I think, a church in an urban place where you have all of everything literally on your doorstep, right? And when I was at Holy Trinity, I ran the feeding program and the shelter downstairs. And, and that was just my whole education on what it's like to live without resources in a place. And when I first started at St. Phillips, there was still the bus station next door. And it was like downtown Durham is like the most glorious place now. But when I first got there, it was 1992, right? And it was actually a little bit sketchy to get to there. And there were like needles in the parking lot and stuff. And so I also think that both of those places then draw people who have that sense of living their faith. Like they're not country club churches, right? Like no country club churches, but it's not just people who want to come on Sunday and then go home. Both of those churches to me have always been the kinds of community that attract people who want to grow in their faith and then want to live their faith right there right? And so I've always thought that that was really a beautiful thing about both of those churches. And also, and again, the exploration, right? St. Phillips was the birthplace of the Journey to Adulthood program, which
That's right. That's right.
If you're in the Episcopal Church, you've probably at least heard of it, and they've just redone it, I've heard. And it was a youth program about, growing into your manhood and womanhood. But also it was really just about how there's rites of passage for kids, and how confirmation didn't really feel like that same sort of rite of passage. And so how do we help kids grow into the adults in faith that they're called to be? And it was just a beautiful thing. But that just came out of the congregation, right? That was not a clergy-led thing. That came out of a group of parents who wanted something really deep and meaty for their kids as their kids were growing up. How do we translate this guidance and the things from the faith and the tradition that are going to help our kids grow into the kind of people who have these kind of lives where they know that they're beloved, and they know that they're called, and they know that they are here to make the world a better place.
Did you have that in the Roman Catholic Church? Because that was another thing I resonate with you. I also, in my early years in Roman Catholicism, I never had a problem with Roman Catholicism until I did. Right.
Yeah.
Until I met,
right.
and it did come through one priest who was very clear and unapologetic, and in my opinion, slightly shaming, in telling me what my role was as a female when I was, 14, all of 14 years old, and sort of what women could and couldn't do. And I didn't have the experiences I had in the Episcopal Church, both at Holy Trinity and at St. Phillips, and even my current congregation, that was so far removed from what my life was like in the Roman Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious if you had that in your upbringing.
Yeah, no, I was just trying to think about that. I still remember when they came into the talk about calling, you could become a priest or a nun, depending on if you're a girl, but they did it all together. I just never, that was one of the first times I thought, oh, that does sound like a fun thing to do. And I was thinking about being a priest then, not a nun. But maybe they didn't make it explicit enough that they were talking about boys could be priests and girls could be nuns, when I heard I could be a priest out of that. So no, I was thinking I always felt really encouraged in my call and in my faith growth and in my leadership in the church. And maybe it was the particular priest that I had, or maybe I wasn't super involved as a kid. My involvement with the church got so much larger when I went to college, and that again, the Jesuits. But in the parochial life, I felt like, to the extent that I was involved, I never felt any kind of, girls couldn't be altar servers at that time, which they can't. That I never felt that. But that was just kind of the way it was. I never really questioned that. Right. Now it would bother me, but then it was just the way things are, that sort of thing. But yeah, maybe I wasn't as involved enough, or wanted to, I never asked to be a server, that kind of thing. But when we had youth day, I got up there and talked and sang and did all that kind of stuff. And I'm also always a singer. So I've always been part of the liturgy, in the choir. So that also felt like I was participating. So no, I did not. I'm lucky, I think, that I did not ever have that experience. And when, in my parents' church, my family's all still Roman Catholic. When my parents had their 50th wedding anniversary, the priest there invited me up to bless them and be part of that, so I've always sort of felt that, although that reminded me of a very funny story. I'm sorry, this is going to be tangential, but it's funny.
No, go ahead.
My grandmother died right after I graduated from seminary. I was just newly ordained, and my family invited me to give the eulogy at the funeral in the Roman Catholic Church. My grandmother was the church secretary, and so the priest called me that was going to at the church, and he was like, this was the one. He said, you cannot wear your collar, you cannot sit near the altar, you cannot participate in Eucharist, and I was just like, as you wish, because it's my grandmother's funeral. I was not gonna. And then my grandmother's siblings found out about that. And my little Italian great aunts went into the rector's office and were like, that is our niece and you are. And then I got another call. I had nothing to do with this. I got another call from the priest who said, you can't wear your collar, you can't sit by the altar.
Yes.
So never underestimate the little Italian ladies.
Well,
Roman Catholic through and through, but they were like, she's our niece. This is her granddaughter. She's preaching and she's a priest, and you're going to respect that. And he did.
Well, okay. There's two things there. First of all, I don't think it's tangential at all. And it never surprises me when people are saying something like, this is a funny story. And then at the same time, it has to in some way do with grief, right? They're like the most sort of poignant and meaningful stories contain both of these things.
Yeah.
So number one, you highlight what I think is so true. Women run the church.
Right.
And regardless of ordination status, I've been a rector long enough to know if I didn't have faithful women in the congregation doing the work of church, we would have a problem. But secondarily, you remind me of my own experience of that. I know, I'm pretty sure you know that my sister died in 2015. She ended her life. And yes, it was a very, very dark time, as one would imagine. And my family's all Roman Catholic as well. And I remember so vividly knowing I would have to wear my clericals because that was they held me together.
Yeah.
And this is actually going to lead, I kind of want to talk about wearing clericals and being a woman, but I asked the priest if that was okay. And he said, of course it is. And he said, do you want to participate in any way? And he even offered the eulogy. And I said, absolutely not. I just was not going to be able to hold it together. Although he did offer that I could share in distributing the bread. And watching my family receive, this will make me cry a little bit. But when you are part of a family that was raised Roman Catholic, who desires it, even if a part of them isn't quite comfortable with it, they do, especially the women. It is such a beautiful thing. And it also kind of is okay. Sometimes people are like, why don't you just leave the Roman Catholic Church? Like they say that to other Roman Catholics, or come to the Episcopal faith. And it's like, we just kind of need this broad spectrum of denominations. We really do. And they all offer different things. And it's okay to be a part of an institution that's not perfect, because that's certainly true in our church as well.
Exactly.
And, it's just, we're not going to find our ideal. So I really resonate with, just that's an amazingly beautiful story that you were empowered and that rector was told what's what.
It's like, and that just reminded me too, we're never going to get through this conversation, but speaking of grief, like when I first went to seminary, when I went to New York, I would go to the Roman Catholic Church around the corner and I would sit in the back and weep. I mean, for months. I mean, I never felt like I left the Roman Catholic Church. I felt like they left me. And that was really hard. It felt, I think Roman Catholicism particularly, I would say it's sort of like Judaism. It's the only denomination where you can sort of be non-practicing and still belong to it. Yep. Because it's so cultural.
Exactly.
And just, I never, ever had imagined my life as being anything but Roman Catholic, right? It's the church, it's just like when you're raised that way, that's just the way it is. And so now that I've been an Episcopalian for longer than I was ever a Roman Catholic, it's very, and I love the Episcopal Church. Of course, I love the Episcopal Church, but it was a process. It was still hard to feel like I wasn't part of that anymore.
So I want to talk about this because one of the things I remind myself and remember often is how when I first started, so St. Phillips was the first church where I was an ordained serving person. And I was terrified beyond measure. I remember that. And I remember I would have dreams on Saturday night before Sundays, especially if I was preaching. And I would go into the bathroom in this dream, look in the mirror, and staring back at me would be a 50-some-odd-year-old white man in geisha makeup with his collar on. I would wake up and just be like, I'm supposed to be a man. Like there is just, being raised Roman Catholic and that cultural imprint of what a priest is, it's still a process. And I definitely think by now, I just had my 14th year anniversary of ordination. Wearing the collar is kind of like, quote unquote, no big deal to me anymore. I'm very aware of it. I don't want to say that with disrespect. But wearing it at first was a terrifying thing to do.
Terrifying.
So not only do you wear clericals and not only, has this been a part of your life for longer than mine, but you, in some ways, in my mind, are a little bit famous for asking, insisting, requesting that people refer to you as Father Cathie. And I want to ask you about that and that story.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, because I've been ordained in January, it'll be 23 years. So
congratulations. Hats off.
So I have always been Father Cathie. Well, so this is sort of, this is where I'll get off on my little feminist rant a little bit. Like when I don't know if you went through this, but when I was in seminary, as everybody's getting ready to get ordained, we're all into it, right? And so everyone's talking about what they're going to be called when they get ordained. And so, and it's like, of course the men are going to be called Father, or if they're in the South, they may be called Mr. because they like the low church tradition, but there's always like a reason for that. And then the women have to sit around and say like, what do we do? Like, and it seemed like a much more complicated problem for women to decide what we want to call ourselves. And so it just made me mad. And I just sort of felt like, no, wait a minute. Like I am a father, right? Like when I become a priest, that is the title for a priest, right? And so I'm going to be Father Cathie. And everybody was like, and I was like, no, I'm serious. And they were like, no, you can't do that. I'm like, why not? Why can I not do that? Right. And so I did, right? And at first it sort of seemed like a joke, but it was never a joke, right? As far as I'm concerned, now, again, this is nothing against how other people understand, and decide what to call themselves, because of course it's still a big question. And it's more of a question for men now too. I believe strongly in titles because I believe in the authority of the church. Like I do not dare do this under my own authority. It's not the Church of Cathie, right? Like I can't do what I do by myself, right? This collar, this title says that the church is behind me, right? That I am bearing something for the church and for the people and for God. And so no way, I mean, of course you can call me Cathie I don't insist that everybody call me by a title, but I'm going to take that title because I need it, right? Like you said, it protects me, it holds me in, it supports me. So, and it is the authority of the church, and ultimately it's the authority of God, right? And that's fear and trembling territory, right? So I absolutely am always going to have a title. If you go by mother, people think you're a nun. They just do. I love nuns. I was a nun. And they just don't understand in the same way that father denotes being a priest. And I also think that, well, one thing I always say, we call God Father. I call God Father, and I don't mean God's a man. So I don't see any reason why we can't call priest father and not mean they're men. I don't care if people know what my gender is, right? Like I think I care that they know what my title, that what my role is, right? And so that's much more important to me. And then I also think that women can have fatherly qualities, right? Protecting and guiding and leading, just like men can have motherly qualities, nurturing and caring and those sorts of things. I don't think we are limited in the kind of character that we have and qualities that we have by our gender. And so it's interesting to me that over time, the whole issue of gender has become such a whole different thing than it was 23 years ago, right? But so it's very different now. But I will also say one of the most important reasons I go by Father is that I'm famous, right? And so, no, and not because I'm famous, but because people talk to me. Right. Because people ask me, because it's something that people can say, because people don't want to say, will you pray for me? But they will say, Father, what's that about? Because then you can start a conversation. And then people think it's odd and people remember me, right? Okay, I'm going to tell you an extremely hilarious story. This is actually funny. When I lived in New York, I was single, and it was the very early days of internet dating. Right. Okay. So this is like 2000. This is 1999, 2000, like way back. And I had a friend in New York, and she was Jewish. It just so happens. And we were like doing this together, doing the internet dating thing together. And so we just would go out on these dates and then we'd call each other and stuff. And so this was so long ago that we had answering machines, right? But we also still had little baby cell phones. And so one night I got home, and on my machine was a message from my friend, and she was laughing so hard I could barely understand what she was saying, but basically call me. And so I called her back, and she was on a date with a guy, and he said, oh, you meet the most interesting people in New York. I went on a date the other day with an Episcopal priest. She calls herself Father Cathie. And my she's like, I choked on my food. I excused myself to the bathroom, and I was just dying laughing. We were out on the same date with the same guy. He was talking about you. And so,
wow. The fact that could happen in New York with the dating pool there is pretty unbelievable.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm not going to go down the online dating road as clergy, because I too went down that road.
Yeah.
And it's how I met my husband. Is that how you met your second husband?
My second husband and I, my true husband and I, we met when he was on diocesan council.
Oh, that's right. That's
and
right.
I worked for Bishop Curry. Yeah. Oh, that's another funny story too. When I said I worked for Bishop Curry, he was the Bishop of North Carolina at the time. Bishop Curry is the head of the entire Episcopal Church.
Mm-hmm.
People don't know that. And so but back then he was the Bishop of North Carolina, and Jeff and I had met. It's a long story, but I was thinking about going out with him, and I was in the car with Bishop Curry. We were going to a meeting or something, and I was like, I swear to God, this is the one and only time I'm going to talk about my personal life with you, and I apologize in advance. And I'm like, if I were to date someone on the diocesan council, would you think that was inappropriate? I felt like I had to ask if it was okay. And he was like, who on diocesan council would you want to date? I totally went into dad mode. And I was like, because most of the people are like really much older. And I told him it was Jeff, and he was like, oh, okay. All right. You can date Jeff.
Okay, that's hysterical. Also, if anybody knows Bishop Curry, either from a near place or a far away place, I think you can relate to the humanity he would immediately show. When one of the clergy in his diocese asked that question. But I have to rewind a little bit.
Yeah.
Because everything you said all of 5 minutes ago regarding claiming the authority of the church and claiming this title that's non-gendered to you and yet gendered to other people. Like, first of all, you need to know how brave that is. Okay. You really do.
Thank you.
Because to do that with others, even being a woman clergy person, I am sure you, like me, have had the experience where somebody says to you, men and women, actually, I think this has happened more with women, where they look at you after a funeral, after a Christmas, after something, and they say, I really don't like women priests.
Right.
But I like you, but you're okay.
Yeah.
And you just sit there and I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
Or
the woman, it was a woman who said to me, please promise me you will not do my funeral.
Nice. That's nice.
Ouch.
It is ouch.
Yeah.
It really is. And so, I mean it when I say it's brave to claim something.
Thank you.
What was that like when you first started? I mean, yeah, sure, it opens a doorway for invitation, but also, Cathie, like, I loved Durham and I loved the South, and in some ways, even here in Baltimore and Maryland, it's a Southern culture in a lot of ways. Mister was the term used when I started at Good Shepherd, but being the first woman, I was not interested in Mister. But you must have encountered some stiff resistance.
Yeah, I mean, I did. I've always been easy about it, right? Like, you don't have to call me father, right? So sure. And I think especially when I first went to St. Phillips, which was my second, I was at Holy Trinity for 2 years. And then I was right after that, I was at St. Phillips. So I was still pretty young and pretty newly ordained. And I think people would like sort of jokingly say it or just say, I can't say that. Like, I'm just going to call you Cathie. And then, which I always said is fine. Right. But if you want to know, and all I said was, don't call me mother. Right. Like, I am not a mother and I'm not interested in being a mother, Cathie. And I, that's the only time I ever correct people, when they just assume, because that's a really reasonable assumption to make, Mother Caimano. And then I say, if you're going to use a title, it's actually father. And I actually got the pension fund to call me father, which is really,
well done.
So I get official Episcopal Church stuff that says Father Cathie Caimano. So it was a process, but I will say, like, there were two things that reminded me. In New York, I ran the day camp, the summer camp at Church of the Holy Trinity one summer. Just let me tell you, that was like the worst. I mean, like, like in the sense that, like, that is the hardest work I have ever done. 100 small children and their teenage counselors. Anyway, but the children, they don't have any trouble with it. So in the morning, I'd come in and there'd be 100 kids and I'd be saying, good morning, everyone. And they would all say, good morning, Father Cathie. And they loved it. And this story, I put it on my blog, actually. This one little girl in camp, her mom came in one day. It's going to make me cry. This always makes me cry. And said, this little 8-year-old girl, she was at school and she said, when they asked what she wanted to be when she grew up, she said, I want to be a priest. And then a boy said, girls can't be priests. And she said, I know a girl who's a priest.
Oh.
And so, like, that to me is because she called me father. I mean, I think she knew I was a priest, right? And so that was such a huge thing. And the other thing was living in New York, and, like, we lived at the church. The church owned it.
That's right. Yeah.
So New York is just a big small town. It's a big conglomeration of small towns. So everyone goes to the same dry cleaner, bagel shop, coffee shop, whatever, Chinese food restaurant. You're the 5 square blocks around where you live is where you live. And everybody called me Father. Like the bus driver would say, "Morning, Father." The doorman, "Morning, Father."
Wow.
And occasionally, like the bagel guy would be like, "Coffee's free today, Father." And so they loved it. Like the almost all guys, and I'm assuming a lot of them were very Roman Catholic from their background. So they just loved it. So I will just say that I sort of remember the good stuff. I mean, I actually got hate mail. I mean, somebody once wrote me a letter about like I had a gender problem and I was probably psychologically ill and all of this kind of stuff. And so, yep. I mean, yes, I definitely did get pushback. I think because I didn't insist on it, then there wasn't anything anyone could do. I mean, because in the end, like a lot of people said, like, I don't agree with it. I don't like it. I don't think it's right. Okay. Like then, it's what I call me, right? So you don't have to call me that, but it's not going to change what I call me. So maybe that says something about me that I just sort of like block that out.
I mean, I'll be honest. I think it says, and this attribute to Brene Brown work and other work I've done, when we have experiences of being seen for who we are, and we know we're worthy of love and belonging no matter what, it's not a problem for us to say, this is what I'd like to be called. And you don't have to call me it, and it's fine if you don't. It doesn't affect us either way. And it sounds to me too, from your early experiences, that you definitely knew that sense of worth and belonging and knowing who you were and that you were loved. And also the experience of knowing God so intimately and easily, which is something I also relate to. It wasn't something, I think it was Jung who somebody asked him once, "Do you believe in God?" And he said, "I don't believe, I know."
Yeah. Yeah. It always feels to me like it's almost not fair. Like with people who struggle with their faith, I always feel like it's like when people ask me that question, I think, I almost don't even call it faith because God is as real to me as you are. And so in some ways, I don't have to have faith, right? In that sense, like, and it's not certainty. I'm still scared to die and I still don't know why we suffer and all that kind of stuff. But I know God and God knows me. I mean, I do feel like the sense that I have of being a beloved child of God comes directly from God, right? So I always say like, God saved my life. And so the least I could do was dedicate my life back to God, right?
Wow. Yes. So yes. And I bet somebody hearing this maybe might think like, it must be nice to have everything all figured out. And that's not true either. And I want to talk about, because I think this gets us to kind of the work you're doing now.
Yeah.
Talk about what's really when you don't have any sense of God's presence, particularly when all of a sudden you're working in the institution you ran towards and, gives you your authority and you love, and yet you discover, the reality of all jobs and all of that when desire becomes responsibility and everything. So talk about that for a second.
Yeah. I'm going to start by saying something that's absolutely true. I was the world's worst rector. And a rector, in case people hearing this don't know, is the head priest of a church. And I never wanted, I still remember talking to you and hearing you say, I definitely want to be a rector. Like, I remember having this conversation. I just remember you having that clarity. I never had that clarity. I never really felt like I wanted to be the soul or the head priest of my own church. But then Scott, the rector of St. Phillips, was leaving and I had to go, and it was just time. And at a certain point in your career, right?
You just have to,
and so I did the whole search. It was like back in the day, because they sent you stuff in the mail, right? Like you were going to college, they sent you all the brochures. And so I went out, I went on this search process. Anything that came from across the Mississippi, on the western side of the Mississippi River, I just threw it away. Like I didn't even open it. Until one day I got this thing in the mail, and I had this big pile of places I was considering and applying to. And I got an envelope from Wichita, Kansas. I will never forget this. I was like, I held it up and said to nobody in particular, Wichita, Kansas? Who's even ever heard of Wichita, Kansas? And then I had just almost as strong as my calling experience. I had that immediate external response in my head that said, you're going to Wichita, Kansas. Like, I just knew before I opened the envelope, this was my church. And it was, and I love those people. And I don't mean to say anything, like, it was a wonderful, I mean, there were some conflicts. It wasn't all wonderful. And that was one of those places where, especially the old guard, and especially the women, some, not all of them, there was some problem. They definitely were resistant of my leadership as a woman. It was a big deal for them. I was the first rector that they had. Anyway, I went there and I was the worst rector because I thought I was in charge. Right. And so I thought, I'll just tell them all how this goes, and then I'll win them over that way. Right. It was just like the worst plan. And I was terrified and isolated, and I didn't know enough to admit that to myself. So this also goes to faith, because this is probably like the most lost I've ever been. I also had just gotten married for the first time. And my marriage also fell apart with all of that happening. So off I went to Wichita, Kansas, a place that no one had ever heard of. We used to joke that, like, had we gone to Africa, more people probably would have come visited us than in Wichita, Kansas, where nobody would come. Wichita, Kansas is a lovely place, by the way. But and so I hated it. I mean, I hated it. So I hated that I didn't really know what I was doing. I hated that I just felt like that I was in charge, and if I had to fix everything, and if I just told everyone how to fix it, then certainly everything would be fine. And I also hated that my job became being the CEO of a small nonprofit, which I did not want to be. And like the meetings and the plannings and the building and the commissions, and I just felt farther and farther from God. I felt like I wasn't praying. I felt like I wasn't helping people in their spiritual lives. I felt like it wasn't helping my spiritual life. I just got totally, totally lost and kind of had, a collapse right at a certain point. So in terms of, like, sometimes things are bad, right? Like, I don't know what this is going to sound like. It was almost like I stopped speaking to God because I was afraid that if I said what was really true, then God would answer me, and I wasn't going to like what the answer was. Right?
So let me ask a question, because one of the things I feel like you do now, and I want to talk about it specifically, is you enable people like me who are still full-time rectors, who I can so relate to. When I started, it's my job to do everything. It comes from, I think, a place of fear. And for me anyway, a place of feeling incredibly responsible for proving my authority that was given to me in the church, and proving my ability to do the job I was called to do, that I feel completely unqualified for, because you have no experience doing that until you are doing it, period.
Right.
And I don't know, I worked in a for-profit professional world, and that was just a little bit different. And you're also just called to wear so many hats.
Right.
And executive director of a nonprofit is certainly one of them. But can you speak to, I think also there's a growth that happens spiritually when you start to realize you can't do everything. Humility is a part of the work. Asking for help is a part of the work. Accepting your limitations and your humanity is a part of the work. And how that becomes something you then integrate into kind of a new level of depth.
Right.
And your relationship with God, and how you find God in something other than just the things we put in the God categories, like worship and prayer. And do you know what I mean?
Yep. Oh yeah, I do. Yeah, because that, I realize now in retrospect, the whole, like, being called to Wichita, like, to only go there and, like, collapse. I realized that's part of the journey, right? Like, that is what I had to learn. I sort of had a true, like, breakdown, and, like, just had a dark night of the soul there. And then I remember I came back and I met with my vestry, and I said, I can't do this anymore. I didn't quit then. I basically said, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to preach and lead worship on Sundays. I'm going to visit you guys in the hospital. I'm going to pray with you and for you. I am going to offer Christian education. And I'm going to oversee that. I'm not going to do that myself. And that's all I'm doing. I'm not going to do anything else. I'm not coming to meetings anymore. I'm never going to a finance meeting as long as I live. I may not be at every vestry meeting. And they looked at me for a really long time, and then they said, it's about time. Right? That was the best my relationship with. The one good thing I can say about all that is I made some reconciliation. I did some reconciliation with the congregation. And then I left within the year. I mean, I was pretty much, and because I was just so broken, but I was coming back, and I realized that part of that authority is trusting in God, right? To basically give the example of someone who believes that God's in charge, right? And that's what the authority is, right? It's not, I'm going to tell you how to do it, and I'm going to tell you yes or no, or even I'm going to hire and fire people, or I don't want to be a manager of people's, employment. I don't think I need to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's not my job, right? So my job is not like any other job, right? It is like I bear the sacraments and the scripture and the traditions and the practices of the faith. That's my job. And then again, it's my job to support other people growing in their relationship with God. And it's led me, again, to the work that I do now, because eventually what I started to see was so much of that kind of structure of what church is doesn't actually have to be like that at all. Mm-hmm. Right. And so why are we working so hard to uphold this kind of institutional stuff that no one wants to do anymore, right? Mm-hmm. And because it's not actually spiritual, that it's not actually bringing us closer to God. It's not actually helping us discover things. So that was the whole transformation. And so eventually I actually left that job without having another job, which I'd never done before.
Wow.
And my then husband and I, we kind of knew that our relationship had been just devastated beyond repair even then, but we were still good enough friends that we had decided that no one was leaving anyone in Kansas. Mm-hmm. So we basically said, we're going to get back to North Carolina together. And so he managed to get a job back in Research Triangle. And so we left, and literally, when I was driving over the border back into North Carolina, I got a phone call from Bishop Curry.
Wow.
Bishop Curry saying, "You want to come work for me?"
Wow.
Even then, he's always been a rock star. He is a rock star, but I was like, there's so many miracles in my life, but that was one. And so that's, then I went on from there, but I think, I'm not sure if I answered your question. But,
no, you did. Yeah. And it, I'm going to be bringing our conversation to a conclusion, knowing for a fact that we're going to be having another one. Yeah. We didn't get to talk about all the things I want to talk about. So that's great.
So fun talking with you.
So much more. Well, you and I have even more things at our residences and similarities than I realized before we started talking. But talk about bring church to people, because this is when I reconnected with you, was reading your blog post around quiet quitting and Edwin Friedman, failure of nerve, very familiar names to clergy folk in particular. And just talk about that and what you're trying to do.
So very, very quickly, I went to work as one of Bishop Curry's canons, because it's vital to the story. And meaning I was one of his associates as assistants, and I worked in the eastern part of our diocese, which was a lot of small congregations, rural congregations, a lot of them struggling. So I was essentially an in-house consultant and clergy coach for 60 small congregations and the clergy who served them. And I did lots of other things. But it was there that I realized that every single church was struggling with the same thing. And every single clergy person had the same vestries would say the same exact words over and over again. And then they would get on the whole, if only we had young people, if only we started then I realized that something's got to give, was really and then Bishop Curry became elected to be the head of the Episcopal Church. So I also knew I was on my way out of that role too. And I thought there has to be a better way. Right? There has to be a better way to reimagine ministry for the future of church, because, and this was well before COVID. In 2016, I started my own ministry called Free Range Priest. And that was the beginning of that. And I didn't have any idea what I was doing. I wrote a book. Don't read it. It's I was sort of trying to write my way into figuring out what I was going to do. There'll be many other things that you can get involved in, including bring church to people. So I started experimenting with Zoom and online ministry, thinking about sort of entrepreneurial, what I call faith practitioners. How do we engage with people in different ways that is not necessarily congregational? How do we sort of bring our churches into the 21st century in terms of organization, but also in terms of technology, which is a big thing. But basically, how can we do this? How can we get to the heart of what ministry actually is without, if you will, all of the overhead? And I don't mean without denominations. I call myself free range priest because free range, I'm out there. Priest, I am full on, stuck to the tradition. So I'm not talking about any kind of wacky stuff in terms of the faith. And so then COVID hit. I mean, everybody would just sort of pat me on the head about like digital ministry. Oh, that's nice. That's really cute. And then COVID hit, which of course was just awful. And my phone did not stop ringing for like 4 months, right?
Wow.
So I really wanted to learn how to, I did practically 24-hour a day Zoom, like tutorials, and
yeah, I started reading you again then too. That's when I reconnected with you without actually talking with you.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. And so even though I do some digital ministry stuff, which I think is important, I mean, I just think digital ministry also helps us think about what do we mean when we say ministry that's beyond Sunday morning worship. Sunday morning worship is really fine, but I think that most churches get caught up in this idea that it's basically, I mean, everything just sort of focuses towards Sunday morning worship. And then there's really not very much else intentional about helping people grow in their faith lives, helping people meet God, helping people understand the faith, helping people, in their times of need, that sort of thing. So, and I started to realize that lots of people were already starting to do different things out there. So earlier this year, I started an online group called Bring Church to People, which is about sort of supporting and gathering people who are doing and being church in new ways. And I'm so glad that you're there.
Yeah.
And that is kind of a new thing. And I'm basically trying to create a space that people feel supported and welcomed and resourced and that sort of thing. I will say I'm very excited because I just sort of worked this all out yesterday that I am going to start offering a course called How to Become a Faith Practitioner. And so I'm going to invite you to that course later too. And it's a course, I use this community platform called Circle, which is sort of like an all-encompassing, it's like your own social media that you own. And it just launched a course builder. And the course builder comes with things like live streaming and chats and that sort of thing. So it's a whole part of this course is going to be that we're going to create the course as the people who are taking it, right? So that the people who need it will be able to talk about what they need. And so then I can develop things as we go to answer the questions that actually people have about how to do and be church in new ways, the people who are actually taking the course. So I'm very excited about that. We are going to produce actual content, but I'm going to do it little by little with the people who are taking it so that to be sure that it is actually addressing the questions that people have. And I will also say a huge part of this, I went into all of this thinking it was mostly about tech. It's actually mostly about money. And
yes, totally.
It's mostly about money. And so it is basically like, how do we reimagine sustainability in ministry? And the more I tried to move away from that, because, it's hard to talk about and it's scary and all that kind of stuff, the more I realized that, nope, that's actually where it's at. Like we have to find financially sustainable models for ministry. And I would argue that we don't have one right now. I think the model that we're used to is just hanging on by a shoestring and a bunch of endowments that we can't see, and that we're all in this sort of terror about how it's falling apart. And we have to get over our fear and get towards, that sort of finding new models. And I'm sure that there's multiple models, but we have to put money in the church. So that's also a huge part of what I'm doing now.
Well, that's okay. So that's amazing, because a piece of that to me is also how do traditional congregations start becoming more than what they have been in terms of recognizing there are communities that would so well connect with the bricks and mortar community, but they may not ever be seen within the bricks and mortar community. And they could still be a part of that community.
And that is my next course on the horizon, by the way, is how to create online spiritual community. I think that using something like Circle, which is what I use, because part of the thing about the pandemic is that the tools and platforms for connecting and creating community has just exploded. And so there's so much more available to us today, even than there was prior to 2020. And I think as a people, we are so much more interested in genuine connection, genuine community. We're interested in our spiritual lives. We're interested in our spiritual health, all of those sorts of things in ways that we have never been, at the same time that nobody's going to church anymore. Right. And so it's like ding, 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 ding. And there's lots of people out there who are not part of any faith tradition, who basically are creating spaces for people to explore their souls. And I just kind of feel like, I guess we should be there too. Right. It's totally fine, but that other people do it. But I also feel like the church should have a place there. And so I think for congregations and dioceses, and this is one of my other sort of like sort of streams of things that I do is talk about intentional online community for your community, right? Like to have a vigorous online space where people meet, they share, they post, there's small groups, that sort of thing. And in my mind, a traditional congregation could essentially do most of their ministry online and meet on Sunday mornings, right, in person, and then maybe Wednesday afternoons or whatever, and would think about the idea of just like what you said, that they could have a very deep, vigorous online community that was part of their community, even if they never showed up, if they live on the other side of the world, or if they live down the block, but they're just not interested in showing up at church.
I know. It's a different time. And I want to thank you for the time that you have given to this conversation. I'm going to be sure that in the show notes, I have the links to all the ways people can find Bring Church to People, Free Range Priest, and connect with you.
Yes.
And what you're calling to mind is a quote that I attribute to Richard Rohr, or Father Richard Rohr. We have to live our way into new ways of being.
Oh, I love that.
And I just, Father Cathie, you do that. And it's a real inspiration. And I'm so grateful for what you bring to the church and the world. And I'm just so grateful. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm grateful to you. And I love seeing you out there. And you're just so wonderful. And I love that you're doing this podcast. It is so
fun. Yay. All right. Well, we'll have you on again. So thanks. Until next time.
All right. Bye. Blessings.